Today, we're going to dive into a very important issue on the world stage, something that is critical when it comes to U.S. public policy and foreign policy and national security. Of course, I am talking about the People's Republic of China. Such a warm and fuzzy name, isn't it? And who better to talk about what's going on vis-a-vis China right now than Gordon G. Chang, who's author of several books, including most recently The Great U.S.-China Tech War, and he's a fellow at the Gatestone Institute, and joins me once again here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Gordon, my friend, welcome back. It's been a while.
Well, thank you so much, Jimmy. And by the way, look at this. Look at this.
I love that. What have you got there?
I have got the official Jimmy at the Crossroads mug, and it was a thrill because on March 1st, I got this in the mail. And because I collect mugs, this really was great. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, shall we cheers for a moment? Cheers, Gordon G. Chang.
Yes.
Thank you very much for sharing it, and I'm glad you like it.
Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
That is so striking to me as we see the new administration of Joe Biden now go nearly into its second month of completion, I guess. What's so striking is the China policy from Biden that doesn't seem to be very tough on China so far. Let's jump right into it. What is your overall assessment of Biden's foreign policy on China so far?
Well, I'm disturbed by a number of things, Jimmy, and especially those on the first several days. I mean, just hours after President Biden took the oath of office, he issued an executive order that repealed President Trump's EO of May 1st, 2020. President Trump banned utilities and grid operators from buying Chinese-made equipment. In other words, protecting our grid from sabotage. And we only have to remember what happened in Texas to understand how it's important to have a resilient grid. And by the way, this is not a theoretical concern because China turned off the lights in Mumbai, in India, in October. So we should not be taking down those protections. So he's done that a number of things like this, where President Trump has issued orders or executed decisions which were important for protecting America. And Biden just said, look, he's not having it. And that really is an indication that Biden does not intend to protect us. I hope that he does later on, but right now it's not looking good.
You know, one thing that has been noticeable to me has been Biden's rhetoric about Xi Jinping, which has seemed way too soft, especially for this time in a presidency. Consider, for example, at this point with North Korea, President Donald Trump was already talking tough and acting tough. He wasn't the more open personality to Kim Jong-un that he ended up being later on in the presidency as he felt that there were negotiations moving at pace. Isn't this a point where you really need to set a firm tone with a nation like China?
Absolutely, you have to. And the first couple of days after Biden took office, he was warmly recalling his meeting with Xi Jinping in Sichuan province. And then, of course, there was that infamous CNN town hall with Anderson Cooper, where the president, when asked about human rights abuses in China, talked about these as if they were just the result of different cultural norms.
I point out to him, no American president can be sustained as a president if he doesn't reflect the values of the United States. And so the idea, I'm not going to speak out against what he's doing in Hong Kong, what he's doing with the Uyghurs in western mountains of China, and Taiwan trying to end the one China policy by making it forceful. I said, and by the way, he said he gets it. Culturally, there are different norms at each country, and their leaders are expected to follow.
Well, first of all, it's not the job of the President of the United States to explain crimes against humanity and genocide, and certainly not in those tones. So this was, at least from I can remember, the most disgraceful performance by an American president about China.
When you talk about Joe Biden's rhetoric on Xi Jinping and recollecting his past meetings and so forth, it's so strange to see an American president say those kinds of things to basically push away any serious discussion of, say, concentration camps of Uyghur Muslims in the heart of China. which is absolutely horrifying, especially if it's the president of the United States, not just unwilling to call him out, but basically pushing the issue aside, it seems.
Yeah, and this was so different from the campaign because Biden during the campaign said he was going to be the human rights president. He was going to call out China on Hong Kong and Xinjiang. And he actually said that what China was doing in Xinjiang, the northwestern part of the country, was genocide. He called Xi Jinping a thug. And then he gets elected, he takes office, and the tone is 100% different. Now, that's not to say that Biden is going to continue this way, but he's got to change because right now, this is not going in the direction that the American people want. It's not going in a direction that will defend the U.S.
Let's talk about some of the language used by the Chinese Communist Party. There's an editorial this week from the Wall Street Journal entitled "The Woke Chinese Communist Party." And they specifically talk about the use of language by the regime in China that is very much symbiotic with much of what the left says in America, the woke left. For example, saying in an editorial in the Global Times of China, quote, "Canada, the UK, and Australia, three members of the Five Eyes Alliance, have recently taken action to put pressure on China. They have formed a U.S.-centered racist and mafia-style community. They are becoming a racist axis aimed at stifling the development rights of 1.4 billion Chinese." The article from the Journal talks about how they are blasting U.S. Senator Tom Cotton as a neo-Nazi and extreme racist, and the Trump administration is an extreme, typical white supremacy government. What do you make of that kind of woke language being used by the Chinese Communist Party and their sycophants in their media to attack the United States and other countries using left-wing language?
Yeah, Beijing has been doing this for quite some time, trying to divide the American people. And it's been doing this also in other countries, most notably Canada, raising the racism card. You know, if we go back for about 13 months, the propaganda assaults against the US have, from the Global Times and also from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, have just been malicious and ferocious. This is just an indication of the inherent hostility of the Communist Party to the United States. And we need to counter this. I know that Biden doesn't want to, but on January 26th, he actually issued an executive order that actually parroted this xenophobic theme that we hear from China about American actions being xenophobic and actually going after the Trump administration. This is really wrong on the part of Biden. He should not be repeating the narratives of a country that is trying to overthrow the government of the United States. And let's be clear, because that's what they were trying to do. Both last year and this year, China has actually been going beyond the language you just quoted and actually inciting Americans to commit acts of violence. And that is more than just subversion, Jimmy. That's an act of war.
There also seems to be a bit of a double standard here from a Biden administration standpoint and, say, from a major corporation like Disney, where they are trying to toe this woke line when it comes to how certain Americans are speaking out or acting in a way that they don't approve of. But when it comes to China, they absolutely will not speak critically about them or their use of language or how they conduct themselves. In fact, a company like Disney will bend over backwards. And just as a minor example, when they were promoting one of the Star Wars movies, they shrunk the character of Finn because he was black and the Chinese regime wanted them to. That is something that they would never do, rightly so, here in the United States. What is it about, say, the Biden administration, other politicians in Washington, when we're talking about companies like Disney, that makes them go after Americans for certain things, but not only let China get away with the same kind of things or much, much worse, really, but abide their wishes and contribute to that sort of suppression?
Yeah, this is really horrifying. And we've got to remember what China's actually doing. China is detaining millions in facilities that meet the definition of concentration camps. It's committing genocide, as that term is defined in the Genocide Convention of 1948. It's institutionalized rape. It is taking children and essentially putting them in what they call orphanages, but are essentially prisons. They've institutionalized slavery, offering it to both domestic and foreign companies. There are credible allegations of organ harvesting, We know that racial minorities are dying in those camps that I talked about. So these are crimes against humanity. And you would expect that if the President Biden were being even-handed about it, just being even-handed, he would be calling out not just China, but also the American companies that have helped that. And remember, Disney in Mulan, the animated feature, they actually thanked a public security bureau in Xinjiang that was responsible for running some of those concentration camp facilities.
I believe it was the live action Mulan, but yeah, I mean, absolutely.
Oh,
It is
yes, you're right.
stunning.
Sorry,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah,
You're right.
just to be sure. That there have been two Mulans, and yes, this time Disney really did their best to not just kowtow to China, but essentially like it's akin to a sort of groveling, is it not?
Yeah, this is just. I mean, I don't know. This is just wrong on every level. Because we're not just talking about a difference in cultural norms, as President Biden said to Anderson Cooper. We're talking about the worst crimes against humanity since the mass exterminations. I mean, since end of World War II. And what China's been doing is actually worse than what the Third Reich did prior to the mass exterminations that began in 1941. So we're talking about atrocities. And there is no sense from Disney that they're going to call that out. We have a whole bunch of NBA stars who talk to us about racism when they are actually
Right.
directly benefiting from their relationships in China, and the
Fair.
use of slave labor. And I'm thinking of LeBron James and Nike, because Nike was making its shoes in a factory that looked like a concentration camp. And essentially, Uyghur women were there under conditions in which they were at least forced and really actually looked like slavery. So I don't think that LeBron James has any role in talking to us about racism.
Yeah, those who lecture us but will not lecture China, they're not to be taken seriously in that regard. Again, we're talking with Gordon G. Chang. He is Senior Fellow at the Gatestone Institute. He is the author of several books, including most recently, The Great U.S. China Tech War. And one thing that is so important as well to recognize is what's happening vis-a-vis China and Taiwan and China and Hong Kong. And let's take each of those in stride and in turn, starting with the topic of Taiwan, Gordon Chang. What are we noticing there? Because there are increasing questions about what China might actually do vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Yeah, China has been ramping up the war rhetoric, especially over since about December. China is actually preparing for war. As of the first of this year, the National Defense Law of China takes away sweeping powers from the Chinese civilian government, hands it to the Communist Party's Central Military Commission, including the power to mobilize the entire country. Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, in January talked about the country having to go to war, being prepared to go to war, quote, at any second. And especially since January, almost every day, Chinese planes have been flying into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, which is considered to be a provocative act. They've also been flying on the east side of the median line that goes down the Taiwan Strait, also considered to be provocative. You know, I think China's just bluffing, but on the other hand, countries that continually bluff and talk about war generally ends up starting them. And especially if they think the Biden administration is not going to come in and defend Taiwan, we could actually see the start of hostilities in the Taiwan Strait. And of course, that could spread throughout the world as China's friends take advantage of the situation to cause trouble elsewhere.
Let's talk about Hong Kong now. There have been trials underway of pro-democracy protesters under recent laws in China. How far do you think the Chinese regime is going to go here in terms of cracking down and then using their court system to do it?
I think that they're going to go all the way, essentially making Hong Kong just another version of Shanghai, no longer a free city. Certainly, China has violated the pledges it made in the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration, which is actually a treaty. So these are legal obligations. With the national security law that China imposed on Hong Kong on June 30 of last year, they have moved to stifle and smother all dissent. And not only have there been these sweeps of democracy protesters being taken into custody, also Jimmy Lai, perhaps the most important democracy figure in Hong Kong, is probably going to spend the rest of his life in jail unless the United States or other countries can free him. So this is important for us because if China feels confident about what it did in Hong Kong, it will move on Taiwan and it'll move on other areas. So this is just sort of like a place where they're testing the Biden administration to see what we will do to stop China's very dangerous and provocative moves.
And one thing to keep in mind, I think, about how China has operated over the course of the past year or so, Gordon, has been when we look at COVID, it seems to me that the Chinese regime used the COVID pandemic as sort of cover where everybody was paying attention to the pandemic over here. And meanwhile, they were making their incursions into Hong Kong, completely violating this treaty and cracking down on democracy and individual liberties in the city. What does that tell you about how China operates when it comes to using one issue, say COVID-19, to provide them with cover for something else that they've been doing?
Yeah, well, they certainly did that because in the first week of May, Chinese troops engaged in incursions in 3 places in Ladakh. It's high in the Himalayas. This is Chinese troops on Indian-controlled territory. And we have seen since then Chinese troops and others from China have engaged in these encroachments and incursions in Sikkim, which is also a part of India, but also in Nepal. And Chinese ships and boats have been engaging in incursions into Japan's territorial waters around the Senkakus in the East China Sea. So since early spring or middle of spring of last year, China is engaged in a number of encroachments and invasions of other territory. And that's a real indication of problems inside the Chinese political system, because what they are doing is radiating out the problems there. And that means whatever happens in Beijing is really our concern as well.
What do you think the United States should be doing as far as policy measures to take against the Chinese regime, especially in terms of what they're doing with Hong Kong and these incursions into foreign territories and what have you? Because, I mean, one thing that the United States did, of course, under President Trump was harsh sanctions against certain Chinese officials, and the Chinese just retaliated by saying, hey, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and certain others, we're going to sanction you in turn. And it seems like the Biden administration may be a little bit fearful about the consequences of going, in their view, too hard against China, either in terms of policy or even just in terms of rhetoric.
Yes, well, we have seen, especially over the last several weeks, the Biden administration, I think, take inappropriately soft measures and rhetoric when it comes to China. You mentioned the sanctions that China imposed on Secretary Pompeo and other Trump officials. Really, what Beijing was trying to do there was they knew that Pompeo wasn't going to go to China, so it was really meaningless with regard to the actual measures. But what they were saying to the Biden administration is, if you go hard against us, we will impose sanctions on you, Biden officials, which means don't do anything to us in the interim. If you get out, you can make a lot of money in China, but don't give us a hard time. And that's a problem because Beijing right now is very arrogant. And that means this is a really dangerous period. They think that they can push the Biden administration around. They are openly talking about this narrative about, quote, the East is rising and the West is declining. And that's a real indication that they're going to make their moves because they think they can get away with it.
So what can the United States do? What should it do, though, to push back? I mean, if you were advising Joe Biden, what would you say?
Well, first of all, on Taiwan, which we just talked about, I would publicly declare that the United States will defend Taiwan. And I would say to Taipei that if they wanted a mutual defense treaty, that we would enter into one. Because if we do that, we prevent any possibility of conflict, because China won't take on Taiwan and the United States at the same time. We, of course, got to work more closely with our partners in the region, the Quad, which is Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. I think that across the range of activities, we need to, basically say, look, we're not going to allow your consulates to engage in espionage. We're going to close them. We're going to cut your embassy staff in Washington just down to the ambassador. We're going to prevent the sale of US technology to China. I mean, we're going to go hard against them because they've gone hard against us. We, go back to May 2019. People's Daily, the most authoritative publication in China, declared a quote unquote people's war on the US. And that was not an aberration because that month there were 3 other articles with these militaristic warnings. So we've been told by China what they intend to do and how they intend to treat us, which means I know it's unfortunate, but nonetheless, we've got to defend ourselves with the same vigor that they're attacking us.
Now, let's expand for just a moment on the multilateral relationships that the United States can and should bring to bear against China. For example, in terms of the trade war with China that the United States engaged in under President Trump, I think that the biggest blunder in that regard was that it was unilateral, that the United States took action against China without rallying other countries that clearly have been harmed in a lot of ways by the Chinese. So I think that that should be an instructive lesson for the Biden administration, that you need to really rally behind some of the allies that you mentioned and others to put pressure on China in a variety of different areas.
Yes, well, President Trump not only went after the Chinese, he went after the Europeans and everybody else at the same time. And that's not a winning strategy.
Right.
And I agree with you that President Biden should try to rally our traditional friends and partners. But if he can't, and he's having trouble in Europe right now, what he needs to do first and foremost is protect the US. And those tariffs that President Trump imposed on China beginning in 2018, what we call the trade war, were imposed as a remedy for the theft of US intellectual property. We know that China has increased its theft of US property recently, especially with the attack on the Microsoft glitch. And there have been also the number of other instances recently of high profile intrusions into American networks. So China's not stopping. And that means that the measures that we have adopted to prevent China from stealing our intellectual property have just not been effective. And as Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe wrote in December of last year, we're talking about a theft of $500 billion a year or so. And obviously, we can't afford such a grievous loss each and every year.
Well, as you know, I have never been favorable to the China trade war. We both disagreed on that point, and I think that this is just proof that that particular strategy wasn't effective, and I don't think it ever was going to be effective. But of course, there are people who are concerned about China's rising economy, yourself among them. And I think you were telling me that by 2028 or 2026, in some estimates, China's economy could overtake the United States economy. What do you make of that? Do you really think that that's viable at this point? Because I'm skeptical.
Yeah, there have been a number of these estimates that we have seen, especially over the last month. I'm skeptical because I don't think China is growing nearly as robust as they claim. They claimed 2.3% growth last year. But when we look at, and they did have a great year on exports, no doubt about that. And they also stimulated their economy with a lot of domestic infrastructure. But consumption, which is the main driver of the Chinese economy, Beijing says, really was much weaker than reported. And ultimately, no society is going to fully recover from COVID-19 until it has safe and effective vaccines. The US has 3 of them. China right now has a vaccine which is moderately effective, but has not been proven safe. And China has not been releasing clinical data from its phase 3 trials. So, right now, Beijing is facing a lot of skepticism among populations that are supposed to get their Sinovac vaccines, including Hong Kong, where there have been a number of deaths reported in the last couple of days. Beijing is now very much on the defensive and is issuing a lot of propaganda saying, well, yeah, our vaccines are safe. But the people of Hong Kong apparently don't think so.